Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for tuning in. We'll just give everybody a few seconds to settle into this meeting before we officially start. But we're so excited to kick off our Meet a Mentor Thursday session with two-time Green alumni, Green Industry Mentor, and Americorp FEMA Graduate, Janessa Ilada. So I just want to start this session off by thanking everybody for coming together during this time in the midst of the coronavirus pandemic. I know this is a very difficult and uncertain time for many people, so it just means so much that you guys are coming out and coming together during this session to meet an amazing person, expand your horizon, learn new things. Love it. All right, so as more people are coming in, hello again, everybody. Thank you for joining. I'm coming at you live from my living room in New Jersey because we're working from home and it's really cozy. My name is Jessica Casal and I am the administrative coordinator for the Green program. We're also joined on this call with my colleague Lauren. So she'll be taking over the chat bar. If you hover over your screen, you'll see a chat bar in the bottom. If you click that, a chat should open up. She just gave us a little message introducing herself. On the right of your screen, you should be seeing that. So feel free to introduce yourselves. Let us know who you are, where you're coming from, how you got here. And you can ask any immediate questions on the chat bar. And also we'll be gathering questions for Janessa for Q&A at the end of the session. Amazing. So again, welcome all. Some of you may be Green Program alumni, welcome back. Some of you might be accepted students committed to a future program, which is super exciting. And some of you may just be pumped to hear more about Janessa, which is beautiful. So really quick introduction for those of you who don't know us, we're the Green program. We provide short-term education abroad programs that are focused on sustainability and renewable energy. Our short-term programs run through winter, spring, and summer break, and they run in Iceland, Peru, Nepal, and Japan. Our entire mission is to provide hands-on learning and industry exposure to individuals that want to learn outside of the classroom, which is so important. And our entire purpose is to educate and empower future sustainability leaders like Janessa. This is a full circle story. And that's so that we can make big strides that we need so desperately in the world of sustainable development and climate change mitigation. Our work goes beyond your Green program trip. We also have an amazing network of over 3,000 student leaders and young professionals from over 4,000 universities and 70 countries worldwide. Just admitting more people. Hello, welcome to those who just joined in. Hey. Technology is an amazing thing. So welcome. Today we'll be chatting with one of our Green industry mentors. And these people are Green program alumni who work for companies or organizations that are changing the game in sustainability around the world. And the entire reason and the goal of these sessions is to highlight the successes, the failures, and the advice of our Green industry mentors so that we can empower and educate more young leaders to be a part of this solution toward a sustainable future. Full circle, people, we're in it. Okay, well, thanks for all joining. Without further ado, let's dive in. Let's introduce our mentor today, Janessa Ilada. Janessa is an Americorp FEMA graduate, and she will be discussing her experience on the federal level of emergency management, and she'll also talk about her interests with state-level emergency management in her home state of Utah. So, let's dive on in. Hello, Janessa. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you.
There's been some aftershocks of an earthquake.
Yeah, and we can delve into that later on in the session. So a little PSA, we are still dealing with aftershocks. So this morning we just had 2 3-0s that I felt my house shake this morning. So just as a warning, if the internet cuts off from my end or it's shaky, I will be back on.
Yes,
but
yeah,
so
it needed to be said.
Hopefully, everything goes well with connections. So.
Yes, absolutely. Well, let's just get on into it. So let's start off from the beginning. Share your background story with us. What did you study in college? What was your journey through college? How did you find out about the Green program? And then we'll dive into how you got involved in Americorp. But let's start from the beginning. Go ahead.
Yeah. So I graduated in public health. I graduated in 2016 in a small college called Westminster College in Salt Lake City, Utah. So I am Utahn. So I stayed in state. Um, Going into public health, I didn't really know what I wanted to do with it because it's such a broad field. Um, and so I spent a lot of my college years doing some traveling, mostly for educational purposes. So one of the trips right before I looked into the GREEN program actually was a Thailand trip that was a public health and nursing related field. And for that, I actually did some homestays. I stayed like in a mountain village, and we staying up there kind of made me realize, in terms of public health, what we could do to help our communities, but also respecting what environment they have and the resources that they try to use in order to mitigate and be able to continue their daily activities. Um, and so looking into that, it kind of opened my eyes into looking into possibilities of other sustainable methods, like what other innovations can we come up with for communities that may be missing out on basic necessities, such as like lights or running water. And so I wanted to look into that path because I didn't know too much about sustainability. And it just so happened that when I looked up programs related to clean energy sustainability, the GREEN program came up. And then it turned out Iceland was one of those countries that they had, that they offered. And I thought, well, Iceland's a country that I was interested in traveling to. So in 2015, before the website looked as it did now, I remembered not knowing anything about this program. And they didn't have Instagram at the time too. So I was really going in just firsthand going, okay, well, I guess I'm the first one of my group of friends that is going to go on this trip. And then hopefully things go out well, which was awesome because I got to learn a lot about Icelandic culture. But on top of that, I got to learn about geothermal energy, just a lot about renewable energy that I had no idea that other countries would use dependently on for like 80 or 100% versus like where I'm from, I don't see that on a daily basis.
Yeah, very cool.
And so, and then later on, that kind of made me interested in more sustainability. So I decided to do a study abroad program in Costa Rica that was a totally different program, not related to my college. But as soon as I spent that semester and came back and finished my final year of my senior year, I knew graduating that I wanted to take a gap year to kind of see into what I wanted to do with public health if it was still public health related. And that led into looking into Americorp, which was kind of unusual because a lot of my friends in public health actually go to the Peace Corps. So I did something a little bit different again, where I looked into Americorp. They have a ton of branches that you can go into. One specifically that really spoke to me was their Americorp and CCC FEMA Corps program. The FEMA Corps program is for those, to be a team member, you'd have to be between 18 to 24 years old. You can still sign up if you're over 24, but you would be a team leader at that point. So it's a program that's focused on civic engagement and specializes on emergency management. So if you're interested in that type of field, that is definitely the type of program for you. So the program would last about 10 to 11 months. And then you would have some training done at your campus beforehand before you go on your deployments. So mine was based in Mississippi. And then every team would have three different, not three different, you'd have three different rounds, but each team had different roles. So my team specifically was a planning specialist type of team. Mm-hmm. And so for that, the kind of roles that you would be, sorry, I blanked out on that. Anyways, the type of roles I was exposed to were more on preparedness for emergency management with FEMA, whereas other teams, they might focus on more response and recovery efforts. So
Remind us what FEMA stands for.
Yeah, so it's Federal Emergency Management Association. I really hope I got that. Otherwise, I'm so sorry I represented them wrong.
That was my guess of what FEMA stood for too, but I was like, I don't want to make a guess. I'll talk to the
I was
expert.
like, maybe I'll look at my handbook. Oh God, I should have had that
No, you got it.
prepared.
Very cool. So you were more involved in the
Agency.
preparedness before a disaster, before like an emergency was to come up. So tell us a little bit more about like what that looked like. What kind of skills did you utilize in your position? What different roles were you exposed to? Because you're working in the federal government, so that's like a huge, huge body. So yeah,
Mhm.
if you want to just dive more into like what a day looked like for you and what kind of things you learned in your experience, that'd be great.
Sure. Um, and we're talking about the day-to-day FEMA Corps, right? Sorry, I was still thinking about what FEMA stood for a moment there because I think it's actually agency. I'm sorry, still thinking about
Federal
that.
Emergency Management Agency, is that it?
I will double check, or someone in the chat box can be like, here it is, it's actually this. And I thank you guys in advance if you look at it, if you look it up right away. Anyway, so the typical life of a FEMA Corps member, for example, so you, during the weekday, Monday to Friday, you would be working your regular 40 hours, depending on what your project was assigned to. So I was assigned to Massachusetts, I was assigned in DC, and then lastly in Florida for the triple hurricane season, if anyone remembers Harvey, Irma, Maria. So I did have active disaster duty towards the end of my deployment. So the first part of that season was, as it got deeper into my FEMA Corps service year, it really delved into learning more about disaster work. And by the end of graduation, like towards graduation, I was full hands-on on disaster duty. So like with my team, we did a lot of planning specialty kind of work where we worked on organizational charts. So as jobs are being added onto for FEMA, such as social media being such a big thing, my team in Massachusetts was assigned to working on organizational charts, making sure that all the new job descriptions were up to date, that they were included so that as these new job positions were being added on to FEMA, we would create these position task books, which I have an example of one I had when I was in FEMA Corps.
Bring it
These
up to the
task books,
screen.
oh, sorry. So these
Look
FEMA
at
task books that we have here, it gives you details of roles and responsibilities that your position is in charge of. It also gives you little tasks that that you should be checking off. So things like, are you completing your certifications, your courses, even stuff that you've done during a project? That's an opportunity for the supervisor to initial off and, okay, that yes, you do have experience in doing this. Yes, you have been certified to do this. It's a really nice way of keeping track of what you've done. As for example, me as a planning specialist, to be able to see like, as you had mentioned earlier, like quantifiable information of what you've done during your time.
That's
So that's
probably
what I.
really great for interviews. Like, you don't even have to make anything up. You have proof of what you've accomplished on a piece of paper.
Mhm.
That's
Yeah, it's super helpful for resumes for sure.
love it. So, and you also were able to see like what federal emergency management looks like. You were exposed to different roles and how the system functions. So you would say that this is an experience to really expose you into the details of how like the federal government emergency management functions, right?
Yeah, and again, depending on what parts of FEMA, like for example, if we just focus on FEMA and not just federal jobs in general,
Mhm.
um, depending on what you're interested in, there's different positions that would expose you deeper into specific scenarios. So just
Very
because I was a planning specialist, it also ties into those who are interested in being a training specialist.
mhm.
So like I said, ours is so focused on preparedness. We would come up with exercise scenarios of working with different cadres, which is another word that we could say like for departments.
Mhm.
Um, and we'll run like week-long mission rehearsals, and each of us would break into groups, and I would be in charge of running a scenario with one group saying, okay, you guys are the environmental historic preservation, and you're in charge of understanding what happens if this historic building collapses, and what are you going to do in terms of like how are you going to recover, what are you going to do in terms of like being able to reconstruct it if possible.
Wow.
um, so yeah, so that's also what was really fun about that, is even though we didn't do too much of on the spot recovery and response, the preparedness was like just as fun, and it really tuned into my skill sets as a planner, like in general in real
Cool.
life.
That
So
actually segues us perfectly into another thing that we talked about 2 weeks ago. So you were telling us that Utah was expecting and planning for a big earthquake. Would you want to tell us a little bit more about this earthquake and what's going on?
sure. I actually have a little visual. So something I'd like to point out here is, hang on, I just want to make sure the map is kind of there. So if you can imagine Idaho up here, there's this Wasatch Fault line. So this main line here that runs from southern Idaho all the way through to central Utah. If you look for Salt Lake or within this area, that's 80% of the Utah population. So our worst case scenario that we're expecting that's supposed to be foreseeable, who knows when in the future, it could be today, it could be in the next 10 years, 50. We're expecting a magnitude earthquake over a 7.0. And why that's such a big issue for us right now, to kind of bring in what happened last week for us actually is we had a 5.7 earthquake happen just last week, a week ago. And that was a little wake-up call for a lot of Utahns here because they actually there was a tweet that went out from the Utah Division of Emergency Management that came out that said 65% of people were anxious because they hadn't been as prepared, even though an earthquake has been something that we've been expecting for so long. So even people who are usually will say that they're prepared for disasters, you just don't know with your fight or flight response. And so that's why we still have aftershocks still coming. And
Yeah.
I guess my last one's happened this morning, so hopefully it just doesn't happen
So
during this
a
call.
question based off of that. It's really interesting to hear like people's reactions, and I would be anxious too, but I'm also from New Jersey, so I have no idea, like I've never like come close to an earthquake ever. But at what point does the federal government get involved in a natural disaster that's like in a state? Because I know that's a state level emergency, but how does the federal government come in with their resources? When would that happen?
Okay. So there, in terms of just natural disasters, I'd like to bring an example like a hurricane versus an earthquake.
Mhm.
So it goes from local level, requesting assistance to the state, which would be your governor. And once the governor goes, okay, state level, we're going to see what we can handle and assist the local counties. Um, they, until a disaster continues to escalate, if the state is overwhelmed and they need further assistance, that's when the governor would call a state of emergency, and that's when FEMA can come in. Because FEMA can't step in to assist in a disaster unless if it's been declared by the state first. So in
So
this case with like,
happening with COVID-19, it's
yeah,
federal government's in it.
yeah, exactly. And in terms of like our earthquake scenario versus maybe like Florida that anticipates hurricane seasons every year, there are two things that a governor can do. He can declare a state of emergency before an event happens, which is what happened during the hurricane season that I was working with FEMA Corps. So when you declare a state of emergency before an anticipated disaster, that helps FEMA come in and provide all the supplies, the blueprint plans that they need, and wait until they have to respond when the disaster hits. In our case, for an earthquake, the governor would have about 72 hours to declare a state of emergency after the earthquake occurs, because you can't really predict earthquakes, just like how no one expected last week's earthquake. So there's two ways you can call it ahead of time if it's anticipated, but in our scenario, it's something that he would have to declare within 72 hours after the disaster occurs. So
Wow, so they got to act fast. There's like a little window after something happens. So preparedness
yeah.
is so important, and I'm so glad that you were trained in that. So I am curious because you went to Nepal with the GREEN program on our first program launch in December, and you were able to see the aftermath of a 7.8 magnitude earthquake. That happened in Nepal in 2015. So what did that look like to you, and how do those observations fit into your interest with sustainability and emergency management in your state of Utah?
Sure. So going out there with it being almost, it was that least, it's almost 5 years since it occurred, because I think it occurred in April of 2015. So just seeing it now, how of course different countries may have different policies and infrastructure plans for how they respond to a disaster, but it was kind of crazy to go in and still see how much of buildings and even roads, like to be walking on, you could still see earthquake cracks like on the roads. And locals just occasionally pointing out like, oh yeah, this building here or these places here are still under construction because the earthquake hit. So building itself back up just made me realize in the state of Utah, for if whenever that 7.0 hits, that's how devastating it would be for us as well, considering that earthquake in Nepal occurred outside Kathmandu. So for Kathmandu to have that much damage occur when they weren't even at the epicenter of it,
Yeah.
just kind of also a wake up call for me to realize if 80% of our population is already within the potential epicenter of this giant fault line area, we have to be prepared for weeks of recovery to respond to that. So that's why it's very important that you have your 72 go bag for sure during this time.
Yeah, and I'm wondering, like, obviously humans are so reliant on our natural environment and we rely on so many natural resources. So do you have like, this doesn't have to be like something that was researched, just your own like observations of how do you think Utah would be more prepared with like their natural resources for this big earthquake? Like how does sustainability fit into a natural disaster mitigation?
Sure. I think that's one of the things that a lot of locals still aren't thinking about,
Mm,
because even with our 72-hour kits, there's so many potential factors that could occur during this earthquake.
mhm.
But one thing that would be very important is, where does our drinking water, like where are we going to get drinking water? If you're someone who doesn't have drinking water in your go bag, there are areas in Utah that, there could be potential flooding. Like our earthquake last week just had water pipes breaking, and that caused some minor flooding. But it's not as bad as what would happen if this magnitude hit, where maybe even our lakes or our dams could just break. Like a lake can't break, but anyways, a lake overflowing or something.
Yeah.
Because that was something that was thought of during one of the interviews I had with someone, where he was like, we have a Utah lake where um, anything can happen, where people just might not expect that they would have to be able to be prepared for. And so drinking water was something, just knowing where to find shelter, because what if you're in an area where roads are totally destroyed? And like I said, with Utah being its kind of special case of, because 80% is all gathered in this little valley bowl,
Mhm.
it would make it harder to figure out where resources would be coming from, and do the locals know how to get to it, or how to create their own supply if they were stranded in an area that they couldn't receive help. Um,
Huh.
and so, I mean, a lot of factors could be similar to other states that have had similar or just disaster type scenarios, but here it's just me wondering, how many of my friends are prepared, and how many of them have like innovations or ideas like that, where it just kind of makes me think like, what can we use without needing stuff like electricity if we were in an area that we couldn't use it.
Gotcha.
So
I just thought of a really, really quick question. I'm not sure if you know off the top of your head, but you were mentioning how like FEMA has all of these different pathways within it and different
mhm.
divisions. Sorry, divisions is the word. Is there a sustainability division within FEMA to address these kinds of concerns?
um, right now I don't know, but I feel like I can imagine there might be maybe a small like related field, because they have environmental historic preservation. There could be a chance that maybe they have specialist positions within that area that do think closely to that type of category, but um, I don't think any of our teams had any specialist positions related to that. So it's kind of hard to call out if we would know. Like, I just know at the top of my head, I haven't seen any cadres where it's specifically under sustainability, but I would say any of those under environmental would probably have someone with that expertise.
Right.
So,
Makes
yeah.
sense. Very interesting. I'm gonna try to research it.
Yeah, me
Thank
too.
Yeah, right. All of us will. I'm very cognizant of time right now, so I really want to hear a little bit more about what is your biggest piece of career advice? We have a lot of young, thriving people on this webinar, so if you could give any advice to future green alumni, people interested in sustainability, what would set them up for success in the future?
So it's just like what everyone's been saying, and I'm sure a lot of people are probably tired of hearing the word network. But I would say if you can meet with as many people in person, that would be my recommendation. However, I think it depends on your field. For my state in Utah, emergency management is such a small community. Um, last last year, I went to a conference for the Utah Emergency Management Association, and I found out that if I wasn't the youngest person there, I was one of 10, and there was at least 100 people there.
Mm.
And I still think I was the youngest one there out of that group of 10 because the other students there were graduate students. And I was just 2 years out of graduating from my undergrad. Um, Something I also learned during that conference was someone saying, well, I have a degree or a certificate in emergency management, but I'm not getting any callbacks for these jobs. And something that I learned from them, that when they explained about it, they said, well, it is a small knit community. Just because you have a certificate, if you don't have any experience, it makes it very hard for HR recruiters to look your way. Just because even if you have all the knowledge in your brain, if you're not out there doing some of the work, it makes it very hard to see if what potential candidates are interested in this field. And a lot of the people in Utah in emergency management are much older. I haven't been seeing as many young people, and I'm striving to get to that position where I can figure out, like, how do I get to that position and how do I let others know, so we can have more young people who might be interested get more involved in this field. I know LinkedIn is one big thing, but actually what's funny for me is that during that conference, I walked away with more physical business cards than LinkedIn connections, because like I said, a lot of people were older and most of them don't have LinkedIn. And the few that did were kind of active on it, and most of them didn't even know what I was talking about. So they would give me their business cards. If you have a chance to email people that you're interested in getting to know what they do, I highly recommend that too. It made me realize, even if it's not exactly that field that you're interested in, they might have something related to what you're interested in. So like Department of Health, you might think, well, that's not emergency management, but they have their own game plans of what they do when they work with hospitals and other states in receiving patients during this time of an earthquake. So you just never know what that path might lead to.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Like, keep your options open, and you wouldn't know the details of any sort of pathway unless you explore it. So don't minimize your opportunities. That's really valuable. Thank you, Janessa. We do have some questions, so let's get
Okay.
to them. All right, so we have a question from, sorry, Sam P. Thanks for asking a question. What kind of background does FEMA desire? What kind of background does FEMA desire in candidates?
Sorry, can you repeat that last part?
What kind of background does FEMA desire in candidates?
That's going to be really tricky, which I don't think we talked about the USA Jobs
This
resume
is a
thing,
perfect,
have
yeah,
we?
time to talk
Okay,
about that
perfect.
application.
I just realized we hadn't mentioned it. So this is really tricky because the number one question I asked everyone at that conference last year, I asked them, how did you get into it? And 80% of those people said, I don't really know how I ended up here. I just ended up here because most of these people were first responders. So that's what majority of people's backgrounds were. Um, if you wanted to get involved with FEMA, that kind of seems to be the pattern too. If you're not involved in a program like FEMA Corps, a lot of adults that I've chatted with that became full-time permanent personnel were either those that had a military background or they were first responders. So even if you were like a health professional or firefighter, uh, anywhere within that Department of Public Safety, that just tends to be the majority of people's backgrounds. Something I also learned, I'm sure a lot of people have looked at USA Jobs. If you were to submit a resume, there's specific keywords, at least with FEMA, I can't speak for other agencies, the FEMA job boards that they post on USA Jobs will have specific keywords that it'll pick up from resumes. So if your resume doesn't have those keywords, it won't go straight to an HR recruiter. There was one that I learned where there was a time where there was a job posting, and maybe like about 100 were submitted, but only 11 were picked up because they had those specific keywords. If you know someone that is on the lookout for your resume, that's another thing too, is if you know someone who is trying to tell you, hey, you should apply for this job, so that they can let the recruiter know, that's the other way too. So it's really tricky if you're just applying for jobs and don't really have that network of knowing, you know, who that is behind like that cadre. So that's something to keep in mind for sure.
That's really valuable. Like there is a recipe to the application. And there's algorithms that look at keywords. I remember learning that when I worked for the city for Philly for the national or Parks and Recreation department. I like talked to a national park ranger about this all the time. So it's really good that now people have you as like a reference for how to apply. Now we have another question from Ava. She said, I would love to hear more about how buildings are determined to be salvageable or not. I suppose after a natural disaster, does FEMA do this evaluation?
So different cadres. So I'm trying to remember which one specifically, because environmental historic preservation is one of them, but then there's also, I'm trying to remember, sorry, I can't remember at the top of my head, but there are several cadres that are in charge of evaluating. So they assess the damages, and depending on which ones require specific cadres to look further into, because it's not just one cadre that will like go in and say like, I'm done with my part, you go in next. It definitely takes a bunch of different people to go in, and one person will say like, from my expertise, like this is what I evaluate, like this has to be done. And someone else will go in and they'll be like, okay, we're in charge of this. So it's kind of like, you can have an expertise in understanding like someone who might be in charge of like earthquake building standards. So, and I wish I remembered the role, so I'm sorry that I don't remember, but I did this exercise scenario with the EHP group. So that's why I was remembering, like, we actually had one where we said, what if this building had water damage because a flood came in? Like, how are we going to preserve that building because it's marked a historic building? And so those specific details would be up to the cadre, but a lot of them will go in, assess the damages, and depending on what types of damage and what types of recovery efforts we're going into for it, is up to them. I'm not sure if that really answered your question. I'm sorry if it didn't, like wasn't too specific, but it's a little bit tricky depending on the type of disaster and what type of building it is, for sure.
That makes total sense. Thank you. We have another question from Isabella. What other divisions in FEMA were you interested in, and what sorts of positions can someone without experience have in FEMA and have within not having a lot of prior experience, like only a summer of experience? Oh wait, oh sorry, I worded that wrong. What position can someone without experience have in FEMA and not with a lot of time, like if they only had a summer to do some sort of service?
That's really tricky. Oh man, if you were interested in being a part of FEMA, but if you don't have a lot of time, that's really tricky. I would say like a secondary option would be working on your state level emergency management, because there are a lot of state employees here. And even if you're not an official state government employee, you can still be associated with other agencies within your state. And a lot of those folks actually have some association to FEMA. So even if they're not a full-time permanent FEMA personnel, they're still, they still have certifications by taking the FEMA courses. And when disaster calls and they're asked to deploy, they still get to work with other FEMA personnel as well. It's kind of tricky because if you're trying to work with FEMA specifically, any federal level, you can't just find an experience short enough to really go, like, can this be quantifiable? Like, can I use this much experience I have and be able to apply for this position? Because actually with emergency management, you need at least 3 years of experience. Ideally, especially if it's disaster experience, if you have that, that weighs a lot more too. So something like FEMA Core is honestly the least amount of time you can spend while also being able to fast track your way into working with them. But if you can't dedicate the amount of time in order to meet that level, if you don't have any prior experience, I would work at a state level and then work your way up that way. Because there are a lot of local people in Utah who are first responders that actually have FEMA connections. So they would still be deployed to disasters if it's needed, if they need extra hands on deck. So there's still opportunities.
That's awesome. That was a great answer. Thank you, Janessa. Really quick, also, were there any other divisions within FEMA that you were interested in, because you were the planning specialist and you did some social media specialist work, but were there any other like pathways or divisions that you were considering?
Yeah, so there were two other things. One of them was external affairs. I did consider that. It would have required me to move to a place like DC, because that's where their main hub is. And I thought a lot about it, if I wanted to pursue it or not. Another option that I was really interested in was a training specialist. So part of what I said with my planning specialist year, my second deployment, which was in DC, was creating all those exercise scenarios. So going to different campuses and just running through all these scenarios with different cadres on like, what if this happened? Or, okay, that worked out well, but what if plan B happens and this totally breaks? So I actually had a lot of fun running through exercise mission rehearsals like that. So training specialist is also like a very strong like second option, and it wasn't even something that I knew that existed. So that was what was also interesting, was like I never thought, you hear planning, you hear training, they're kind of similar, but there's so many specialist positions that you might not realize like that might be more your niche. So yeah, those were the only two after planning that I would have considered.
That's really cool. And those are available to you as a part of the program that you did? Like you can choose which path? Awesome.
So actually, with the way that my campus did it, they actually did a survey. I heard different campuses didn't do that. So I know with my Mississippi campus, they took a survey and they based off your answers to what they think your specialty would be. So it just so happened that they thought I was a planning specialist, and it worked really well. So
Yes.
I was really happy with that.
Wonderful. Thank you. Does anybody have any final questions? If you do, get those fingers typing, type it in quick. Looks like we're good. This was really such an amazing session. You've shared so much valuable insight into what it looks like to work in the federal government for something like FEMA, and it's such a relevant topic right now with the fact that an earthquake happened in Utah last week. So learned so many interesting things, and I just want to thank everybody for joining us today. Janessa, for you being here, and just all of you listeners for coming together during this time. From our laptops. If you're interested in starting your own green journey with us, we're currently enrolling for summer and winter programs, and you can apply at our website at thegreenprogram.com/apply. And just note that we're not traveling until August 2020. We've come up with a different two-part program module for our Iceland May and June programs, where you can learn now and travel later once it is safe. So definitely learn more about that on our website. We'll also be having an online info session next Tuesday at 5:30 p.m. so we can talk more about the new program model in that session. And finally, for all those alumni out there, we have an alumni reunion heading out to New Orleans in November, and we're still enrolling for that, so we definitely encourage you to register through our website. It gives you an opportunity to connect with more incredible green alumni like Janessa, who are making waves in their career. And just thank you so much for this session and for everyone who joined. This will be also emailed out to everybody, the recorded session. Everyone who RSVP'd, look out for the video, pause it, take notes, and let us know if you need anything else. We'll be here to support you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Janessa.